Okay, so I'm going to show you guys how to use the one-shot sample function in Ultimate Heavy Drums. So first we're going to go on the kick section of the mixer, and then we're going to go to the file section and we're going to locate the samples of the one-shots that you will have received as a separate download with your order of Ultimate Heavy Drums. So I've got kick one-shots here. Now currently I've got the default kit loaded up in terms of the preset that I'm using. So this is the Yamaha 22 Remo head. And the kick sounds like this. And I'm going to load in a one shot of a different kick drum to blend in to get like a new and different sound to blend in with that kick drum. So I know I really like the Tama 22 Resident head off. So we drag it from the left over into this section here. And you can unload that and select a different one. So I can try out this Q kick drum here. And now that is going to be triggered with this kick drum here. So when blending in samples, we really want to make sure that they are in phase with the original kick sound. So I'm going to solo the close mics, and I'm going to invert the phase button here on the one-shot sample and see how in phase it sounds. So usually when it sounds like there's more low end, that means it's in phase. So having this button inverted here sounds better to me. Now the best thing you can try and do is try and make it sound as out of phase as possible and as thin as possible, and then you just want to invert the phase. That to me is the easiest way to get something in phase, is to try and make it as out of phase as you can, because then you can really tell when something sounds really thin all of a sudden that the moment you flip it, it's going to be in phase. So another way you can refine this process is using the pitch control. So you can do it either to the original kick or the one-shot kick. So that sounded pretty thin down there. So I'm going to go back to having this phase button off. So that sounds pretty thin there. Cool. So I'm going to blend that in with my original kick sound. So one thing to note with these kicks, with the kicks coming from the contact instrument, there are multiple velocities, and at each velocity layer there's usually around 7 different what's known as round robin samples. So you'll never hear the exact same kick drum in succession. Now I wanted to make sure that these were really balanced sounding between every hit, and I really wanted to emulate that triggered sound, but making sure that there's enough kind of realism and difference between each hit that it doesn't sound too machine-like and robotic. Having said that, tons of my favorite records from people like Andy Sneap, Colin Richardson, all have pretty much just like a one-shot trigger sound for the kick, and I kind of like that sound anyway. So you can fully replace these kicks by just using the one-shot sample. I can mute these. But it's pretty cool to kind of find new sounds by blending samples together. But if we were in the world of real drums and these kicks coming from Contact were like a real kick drum played by a real drummer, and there would be tons more inconsistency with the playing, what you could do is hold down the low end and keep the low end completely uniform by relying on the sample. So in this case, turn the tilt EQ all the way to the left, and then get more of that realism and inconsistency from the quote-unquote real kick drum, and have all the high end coming from that one. Now, as I said, the samples in the library, they don't need this because I've made sure that between each hit, they're all very uniform and they're going to have that really consistent sound to them. But this is, again, just another way of experimenting and finding new sounds. So we're going to use all the low end from the sample and all the high end from this multi-layered and multi-sample kick drum. And as you can hear, that's a different sound to how it would be without the sample blended in. So as I said, you can just experiment, find your own ways of blending in different kick samples and making them work together, or if you wanted to, just completely replace the kicks with a one shot. And you can also load up any sample you want. You don't just have to use samples from the library that come with it if you have your own collection of samples that you really like the sound of. But the thing with the one shot is it is just a one shot sample, so there is just the one sound, and it's not going to have a organic or real sound because you're just hearing the exact same sound over and over again. Whereas the kicks in the library, they're multi-sampled, so you're never going to hear the same kick in succession. Same with the snare. So moving on to the snare, I'm going to go to the snare folder here. I currently have the mid-tuning Gretsch bell brass, so I'm going to blend in a sample that isn't that one with it and hear how it sounds. And I'm going to do that same thing where I listen to the close mics. These are processed close mics. This is snare top and bottom process, same with the one shot sample, and I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to try and make it sound as out of phase as possible, and hopefully make it then in phase by inverting it. But what I'm going to do next is just listen to the snares on their own and try and listen into the pitch of the drum and try and just match the pitches and then see how the phase sits. So the one shot sample has like a deeper, fatter sound to it, but it is actually seems like the note is a bit higher. So it sounds better down minus 0.85. And it sounds pretty good just as it is without inverting the phase button there. And the way we've got the one-shot samples working in terms of velocity is you hear them a lot more prominently at the harder hits and a lot quieter for the softer hits. And this is because if you get a one-shot sample in phase with a really good solid rim shot, it doesn't necessarily sit in phase with your fatter, softer, non-rim shot snare hits. So you won't hear it as much on the softer hits, and that's quite deliberate, so you also don't get really machine gun-like snare rolls. And something you could do to get a really unique sound is if you had like a higher tuned snare and then blended in a really low snare sample like this one. Now, ideally you'd still want to get them in phase, but just to show you quickly, you could go about just having the reverb from the one shot and not actually having the one shot in the mix, but just having the reverb from it. So we're using only the ambience off a really deep snare sound, and you could potentially combine that with the close mic sound of like a higher tuned, more crank snare, and kind of get the best of both worlds and just have an experiment with different ways of creating different sounds. That's not a technique that I've actually ever used personally, but it's definitely something you can have an experiment with if you are liking the sound of higher tuned snares, but you want them to still have the appearance of like a thick, fat sound. So there's all kinds of different techniques you can do in that regard. So I'm going to load up some other snare sounds now and just show you again how I'd go about getting them in phase with each other. So I'm going to use the 402 Superphonic Ludwig, and I'm going to blend in the Gretsch lower tuned snare. I've got the volume down there so I didn't hear it, so let's have a listen. Cool. So I'm going to listen to the pitch of this one. And I'm just going to try and match the pitch. So let's see how they sit in phase with each other. So yeah, if you try and match the sustain and the ring of the snare and try and listen into the pitch and get that right, hopefully your phase should work pretty well. But you could always, as I said, just go in and try and make your snare sound as out of phase as you can and see how that works. And you can still find that you'll get them in phase even if they're not necessarily the exact pitch. So for example, that inverted with the pitch down a bit, still sounds kind of in phase as well. So we can have a play around with those sounds in the mix. Another trick you can do is add a lot more sustain from the one-shot sample. Get a bit more of the ring to come through, and then your close mic to be a bit more focused, and it will sound a bit better on like fast rolls, that kind of thing. And again, you can have a play around with using a bit more high end from the one-shot sample, a bit more low end from the one-shot, and kind of mess around and see if you can find some interesting combinations, that kind of stuff.